And now, how do you recognize and how do you deal with a real crisis? To do so, the right time is key according to our very special guest speaker today. He was the first UK Security Intelligence Coordinator, and he is former head of the GCHQ, the Digital Intelligence and Cybersecurity Service in Great Britain. And a very warm welcome to you, Sir David Omand. We were hoping to have you with us live here in Oslo, but you're with us from home.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Siri, and good morning, everyone. I had indeed planned to be in Oslo to deliver these remarks in person, but sadly on Sunday, I tested positive for COVID-19. There's nothing like falling ill with COVID-19 yourself to act as a reminder of the importance of protecting the population as we adjust to the long-lasting presence of COVID-19 and future zoonotic diseases that jump the species barrier, and to remind us in our digital age of the need to protect ourselves from hacker groups that have spread anti-vax disinformation to our populations, and to protect us from autocrats like Vladimir Putin, whose agencies tried to hack the pharmaceutical companies and research laboratories that were developing the COVID-19 vaccines. At the time the Cold War ended, we could all dream that we could just get on with our lives, secure in our values and freedoms, patiently building a better society in our privileged part of the world and helping others in less fortunate circumstances around the world. That dream was violently interrupted by terrorism, first from Al-Qaeda and ISIS, then from the fanatics of the extreme right. The dream was also violently interrupted by waves of cyber attacks by states, non-state groups, criminal groups, attacking governments, attacking critical infrastructure, companies large and small, and attacking the public directly. Now, I think we have responded, as civilized democratic societies do, to protect ourselves within the law. But then we found that our democracy itself was under sustained attack from Russia, trying to interfere with free elections and using digital dirty tricks in the grey zone to confuse and deceive us. And then, just as we were recovering from the worst of the pandemic as this year started, we woke up again to discover that the foundation of what we thought was the accepted security order in Europe was being undermined by the brutal Russian invasion of Ukraine. The Norwegian approach to such a chaotic world, with what for shorthand let me call a modernized total defense concept, is of great current interest in the United Kingdom. It was only last week that the independent reviewer of British civil contingencies legislation, Bruce Mann, a former close colleague of mine in the Cabinet Office, published a detailed and critical report concluding that over the last decade, a decade of financial austerity, resilience in the UK has suffered strategic neglect and in some important areas has gone backwards. That lack of development in overall British societal resilience is in sharp contrast to the success in other protective security fields, especially cybersecurity and counter-terrorism, where the UK capability is, I think, world-beating. The government response to this independent criticism is expected to come shortly in the form of the first UK National Resilience Strategy, an ambitious step to which I'm looking forward. An important part of the new resilience strategy will, I hope, involve more attention being given to how to obtain strategic warning of future threats. So let me offer some thoughts on that subject, drawn from my own current research for my next book that I've provisionally entitled Crises and How to Survive Them. Now, I regard a crisis as more than a big emergency. We can handle even big emergencies given wise preparations. Most such emergencies are what I call sudden impact events, such as a serious transport accident or a flash flood. And out of a blue sky, for example, the WannaCry worm from the Lazarus hacker group in North Korea arrived. It froze the data on which the British National Health Service depends. Urgent medical operations had to be cancelled as MRI and other scanners became unusable. And then a year later, the sudden impact of the NotPetya virus from Russia that nearly destroyed Maersk, the world's largest shipping company. A modern economy relies totally on such unseen IT and logistics systems operating effectively. So we've got to think about preparation. But for me, a real crisis is when the pace and scale of adverse events threaten to overwhelm decision makers. I call this the rubber levers test. Orders are given, capabilities are mobilized, but every lever, when it's pulled, appears to be made of rubber and does not seem to bring the situation back under control. The effects of the crisis then spread through society, and sometimes the measures we take, with the best of intentions, like closing schools to cut down infection rates, then create yet more problems as parents have to stay in to look after children that are not available for work. I have an acronym, IED, where the I stands for the impact of the event, the E for the extent of its penetration into society, and D for the duration of disruption before some semblance of normality returns. And our preparations have to be designed not just for that initial impact, but for preparing policies and plans to limit the reverberations from a disruptive event and investing in national resilience to shorten the period of disruption. And you'll recognize the approach here from the well-known risk equation that the risk to the public is the product of the likelihood of some bad thing happening, our vulnerability to it, the initial impact should it occur, and the length of time that the disruption lasts. Now, there are some areas where we can all reduce the likelihood of trouble. We can make sure our IT systems are patched, we don't run out of date software, we monitor networks or use secure clouds. We can reduce the number of aircraft or industrial accidents or blowouts on oil and gas rigs by insisting on rigorous safety cultures and, where necessary, imposing the precautionary principle. But even then, unexpected things will happen. As we saw with the great financial crash in 2007 and 2008, long-tailed distributions exist, and 1 in 1,000 years events can still happen. So the likelihood of suffering an unexpected crisis is never zero. But there is also a different class of events that can lead to crisis, both in government and, I would suggest, in the private sector. And these are what I call slow burn problems. And many of these, if they're not caught early, are certainly capable of causing major crisis. My analogy is a cigarette butt carelessly tossed away during a walk on a forest path in high summer. By mischance, it lands on some tinder-dry moss that starts to smoulder. A small fire starts, and again by mischance, the wind gets up, changes direction, and fans the flames. So we've all seen the disaster movies. You end up with a raging forest fire with the fire front rapidly approaching a village. And it's that same story of issues that are ignored at first and then worsen into crisis that's a familiar one for business and government alike. Now, self-evidently, the key to preventing these slowly developing problems becoming real crises is early intervention. But that requires early warning that there is a potentially serious problem brewing. And that needs to be a warning that's capable of changing the minds of leaders and make them pay attention and to act. And that can be hard, especially if it is likely to involve making more resources available. The WannaCry ransomware was only a problem for the British National Health Service, because senior managers hadn't felt they had the resources to spend on software upgrades and replacing old assets. That was, for that reason, a crisis just waiting to happen. If I return for a moment to my forest fire example, we could have continuous monitoring by a constellation of little satellites with visual and infrared sensors, couple it to big data analysis in the cloud, have AI algorithms to warn people when a small hotspot has appeared that doesn't follow the pattern expected for that location at that time of year. Technically, it's doable today, but it's very expensive. And of course, the issue is, given future climate change, would we be prepared to consider such a system? Well, California might. Getting corrective action taken early is especially difficult, I think, when what's being flagged up is a possible failure of government or corporate posture and policy. So expect resistance when an analyst pops up saying that sticking to the present course is leading us into danger. A recent example would be Afghanistan last year, as the Taliban swept across the country and into Kabul. Afghan experts had been warning for years of the habit of local military leaders inflating the numbers that were being trained in the Afghan army in order to claim their salaries. But few in Western donor countries wanted to address the implication that if the Taliban did mount a big offensive, not many of those who were trained were likely to lay down their lives for a central government thought to be corrupt and that was doing little for their home villages and provinces. Now, my point here is not about Afghanistan, but about how we can ensure bad news as well as good news travels inwards and upwards to the most senior levels in organizations without filtering or distortion. Optimism bias, as it's called, is very prevalent in can-do cultures, especially when sacrifices are being made in blood and treasure. The former US Defense Secretary, Robert McNamara, said in his moving memoir, In Retrospect, that he deeply regretted that during the Vietnam War, he didn't ask the tough questions that he should have, and he found himself being fobbed off with complacent answers. I suspect this is a common phenomenon. Politicians and civil servants can feel inhibited in challenging the chain of command, subconsciously feeling it disloyal to those on the front line to question whether the underlying policy is working. Senior officers and officials, when visiting the front line, are liable to be faced with commanders and executives putting on their war faces and being reassuring that, yeah, it's tough, but this is a can-do operation and we'll make progress. Any private sector chief executive will recognize the problem of finding out what is really going on outside head office. So I conclude that part of resilience is fostering a culture that's capable of absorbing and acting on less than good news, for which we do need to build stronger central analytic capability that can do the necessary analysis to support challenge, but quietly, without the fear that it will all become public prematurely. And one of the main reasons for reluctance to admit to slow burn crises is probably embarrassment over past optimistic assurances given to the media or to markets. I've always felt that leaders in government and the private sector need consciously to create safe spaces where uncomfortable truths can be shared privately and issues tackled early. I served for 7 years on the Joint Intelligence Committee in London that since 1936 has provided British government with warning of developments in international affairs. They have a well-established mandate for warning, telling truth to power, even when unwelcome. But there are two problems. The first is that such a remit is traditionally restricted to the subjects on which secret intelligence can shed light. And we know there are many other risks out there. There will be national security issues, for example, generated by natural hazards such as pandemics, disrupting supply chains, or by new technology. such as, for example, quantum computing. What do we do if China is the first to develop quantum computing on a scale capable of breaking the public key encryption on which our most sensitive military and financial communications are based? The second problem is the obvious one, that nobody has a crystal ball. The Joint Intelligence Committee cannot predict the future, nor can anyone else. But if you have up-to-date situational awareness and a sound explanation of the facts on the ground, then you can provide estimates of how events may turn out on different assumptions. And you can include any less likely but highly damaging possibilities. And that can generate useful warnings. But of course, it still requires government to pay sufficient attention. My example of quantum computing illustrates the value of having the analytical capability in government to work from an imagined future back to the present in order to anticipate the problems that such a future would create for us. If we can do that, then we have the chance to consider what could we do now to manage that future risk. In my example, it might be funding more research into quantum resistant encryption, or tasking our intelligence agencies to keep a careful eye on Chinese quantum technology. I call this acquiring strategic notice. It's working from possible imagined futures back to the present. And the method applies both to hazards, such as climate change, and to developments in malign threats. The other method, which is Bayesian inference, is starting with the recent past and trying to work forwards into the most likely options for the future. So I use the acronym SEES to describe these outputs of analysis that can help the policymaker: situational awareness, explanation, estimation, and strategic notice. The British government has recently set up a national situation centre in the Cabinet Office with modern data tools to improve risk analysis. And it's been described as a game changer in helping last year with risk management over COVID-19. But even if we have such capacity for data analysis, the analyst still has to convince the policymaker to take the early indications of a possible slow burn crisis seriously enough. A warning is not a nice to know bit of information to which ministers might politely reply, "Oh, thank you for keeping me informed." The intention of a warning is that action should follow. And a useful word here is that of anticipation in its proper sense. I am, I have to confess, eagerly anticipating my 75th birthday in 2 weeks' time. That means more than that I know I will have a birthday then. It means I've conjured up in advance in my mind what it would be like, the party we'll hold, the opportunity to see old friends. The essence of the warning problem is how to convey such a sense of anticipation to another person. Not just to convey a fact, birthday coming up, an email could do that, but a vivid sense of what the event will involve and its implications. So the analysts must anticipate the national security implications of their forecasts and craft their warning to transfer that mental picture of the metaphorical smouldering cigarette butt in the forest to the minister or senior policymakers. If we want to identify slow burn crises and have early action, then we need that vivid anticipation of danger. Let me conclude my remarks this morning by a reminder of there are obstacles that can get in the way of warnings. Anyone faced with a major decision, whether in public or private sectors, has to integrate two different thought processes within their single mind. On the one hand, there's the emotionally and values-driven considerations of what I wish the situation to be and what I want to achieve by my decision. And on the other hand, the limitations that rational analysis reveals of what is and the practical limitations of what can be. And that's true of presidents, it's true of prime ministers, it's true of all of us when we face a potentially life-changing personal decision. Both kinds of thinking, I emphasize, are necessary. Where would we be without the determination of a Churchill in 1940 or of a Zelensky in Ukraine today defying the odds? But that values and emotionally driven thinking needs to be bounded, especially in today's social media driven world, by the rational analysis that comes from understanding the realities of the situation on the ground and the limitations and costs of the options that are open. With that, let me conclude and hand back to Siri.
Thank you so much, Sir David, for sharing your experience and knowledge with us. And coming to mind when you talk about a slow burn crisis is, of course, the war in Ukraine. And how does that war fit into what you have just described?
It's an example in a number of ways. The first thing to observe is that the significant Russian aggression towards Crimea took place, in 2014. So that should have woken us up to the wider possibilities. The warnings were there, but we didn't always heed them, perhaps, as much as we should, and the necessary deterrent messages weren't really conveyed. So we may have inadvertently given Russian leadership the impression that we didn't really care all that much because Ukraine was not a member of NATO. That would have been a very narrow interpretation to place on it, since, as we see, we now have a very major war in the center of Europe to contend with. So it's an illustration of the need to look out for crises, slow burn crises, that could develop into something really, really serious, and then act early.
And you also mentioned that the can-do cultures, which you have been a part of most of your life, they can be a problem in their own right. And you talked about how to stimulate the kind of environment where people will talk and give honest answers to their bosses. How do you do that in practice? Could you share some examples from your time?
I think it has to start from the top. So the leaders have to make it clear that they are interested in proper analysis. They're interested in the situational awareness from the ground without intermediate layers filtering it or in any way distorting it. You can see around the world that when leaders surround themselves, often after they've been in power for a long time, with private offices and advisors who are anxious not to upset the leader and therefore filter the information, that's when you get really serious problems. We can see that in Russia today. You have to know what is really going on. So you have to create that correct impression, that you're willing to receive bad news as well as good news, and that people will be rewarded for bringing bad news as well as good news. The worst possible message is to shoot the messenger because you didn't like the message. That very quickly spreads, metaphorically, through the organization. And people then there's natural temptation, perhaps, for many intermediate levels of executive to say, no, I can fix this myself. I don't need to worry the boss with this problem, which is fine up to a point. But when it goes wrong, of course, it goes very badly wrong.
And have you seen in the field that the unwillingness to actually do this work has created problems? The can-do culture has become a problem.
Yes, I mean, the early days when the civil war broke out in Bosnia, for me, I was dealing with that subject in the Ministry of Defense. You would visit our United Nations contingent, British Army contingent working with the United Nations, and they would put on a brave face, but the impression was very clearly that this isn't working. And then to get that message back, to say, actually, unless there's a major change of course, there will be a disaster. And sadly, that's indeed what happened at Srebrenica, is very difficult. And people don't like to be told that the policy they're following isn't working.
We have heard today from Anne Neuberger and the US side that they see now a need for unprecedented information sharing from the government to the private sector. And I'd like to hear your views on that. Do we need to think differently also when it comes to information in the government agencies?
Yes, I think Anne, of course, would have been talking about the cyber world. And that is, she's absolutely right. I don't think progress can be made in protecting the nation, protecting the critical national infrastructure, which is mostly run by the private sector, if information about threats is not shared and information is shared the other way from industry about what they are experiencing. And that needs to be done in a sensitive way that protects the commercial value and sensitivities for industry. But it can be done. And in the United Kingdom, I think we are now doing that very successfully indeed with the critical infrastructure through our National Cybersecurity Centre. But it also means sharing other kinds of information between the private sector and the public sector. The resilience of our critical infrastructure to disruption and shocks, other than cyber shocks, also means that there has to be pre-planning between private sector and public sector. The sort of planning that in the United Kingdom we do under our Civil Contingencies Act, which, as I was saying in my remarks, we need to refresh, we need to reboot, we need to get more effort into planning against the sort of disasters and problems that inevitably we will face. I think the COVID experience showed us that we have a lot to learn about how to organize ourselves to deal with major crises.
And you mentioned the Norwegian total defense concept and British interest in that. And you know Norway very well. What do you think is particularly interesting when it comes to total defense?
I think it's the ability to envisage how all the different parts of society can, if the crisis arrives, contribute. So that's taken into account in the plans and then in exercises, in training. I'm particularly impressed by the way that the Norwegian armed forces work with the civil authorities. We obviously do some of that in the United Kingdom, but it's not as advanced, I think, as it has been traditionally in Norway. And that, I think, is a major emphasis of the current British government looking ahead to see how could we actually get a rather closer relationship between the armed forces and using their capabilities for civil contingencies and for domestic crisis, whether it's come from a threat or from some natural hazard.
And I'd like to hear your views finally on the factor of trust. And Norwegians known to be more trusting than most peoples. What is trust worth in this new environment of threats from of many kinds? How should we look at it? Is it a good factor, or do we need to do something about our mindset and attitude?
Trust is right at the heart of an effective society. We can't operate without it. It's quite a slippery concept. It's difficult to pin down and measure what is trust. I prefer the use of the word trustworthiness. In other words, so that you have demonstrated to the satisfaction of someone else that your behavior is worthy of trust. So you've consistently, over a period of time, demonstrated you do what you say you are going to do, you keep your promises, you keep your confidences, you build up that reputation for being a trustworthy person. But it is context specific. I think many parents, like me perhaps, would have trusted their children with their wallets, but not necessarily with their high-powered sports car. So it does depend, trustworthy for what, you know. But if we're going to have sensitive information exchanges, as Anne Neuberger correctly identified, then the private sector has to trust that the government will keep its secret, and market sensitive information, which a company might have after it's been cyber attacked, won't suddenly appear in public. And the government has to trust the executives within the critical national infrastructure that if it shares in advance very sensitive intelligence about the direction of future cyber attacks, that again, it's not going to leak out and compromise their sources.
Thank you so much for being with us, Sir David, and I wish you a fantastic celebration of your 75th birthday soon.
Thank you very much, Siri, and thank you all for listening.